You were the first episode we ever recorded and published.
And that's really a key cornerstone of the study of economics is, the rational consumer.
And we're back for round two now, and it's a year.
Some things have stayed the same, like WA shooting the lights out, and some things have changed.
What's going on in the world, Dan Gradwell?
The best place to start, I reckon, is to rewind to the last time we spoke. The most significant change, of course, has really just come in the last 3 months, which has been around a really different outlook and experience in terms of interest rates. But then what really has caught us and the rest of the market by surprise has been just how quickly we've pivoted towards the rate hike that we saw a fortnight ago.
So what are you expecting for the next 12 odd months? What's the crystal ball saying?
I think there's a few different crystal balls on the market because the views are pretty different.
How's Australia sitting economically in the world? What's happening with our property prices? How are businesses operating? Are we strong? Are we weak? Are we getting it right? The answer is yes. So this is a really good news story for Australia generally. For WA, definitely a good news story. Dan Gradwell, economist from ANZ, is coming back to give us his 2026 update and an outlook to where we're going and how we've fared so far. Come and have a listen to this. What's going on in the world, Dan Gradwell?
Sure. Plenty. And probably the best place to start, I reckon, is to rewind to the last time we spoke, which was nearly 12 months ago, I think, and sort of observe what's changed since then. And the most significant change, of course, has really just come in the last 3 months, which has been around a really different outlook and experience in terms of interest rates. I think when we spoke last time, we were talking about ANZ Research's view was we were going to get 4 rate cuts through 2025. We ended up with 3 of them, which is pretty close. But then what really has caught us and the rest of the market by surprise has been just how quickly we've pivoted towards the rate hike that we saw a fortnight ago now. And that all just comes back to that really one inflationary print that we saw towards the end of last year. And then the economy continued to build momentum through the final quarter and really showed that, I suppose, the economy had responded really positively to those rate cuts that we did have last year, but ultimately a bit too strongly, and has driven the need now to see this interest rate increase to try and cool things down just a little bit and make sure that we don't have a repeat of that inflationary experience that we did have back in 22, 23, when inflation really ran away from us. And we know that that really was the turning point that triggered a lot of the cost of living crisis that we're still hearing about today. So I think that's where the RBA is coming from. They're really keen to avoid a repeat of that and make sure that we can keep inflation a bit more contained. And that has meant that the experience for interest rates and the outlook as we move into this year is quite different to what we were expecting only, say, 6 months ago.
So what are you expecting for the next 12 odd months? What's the crystal ball saying?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a few different crystal balls on the market because the views are pretty different. maybe if I kick off with ANZ Research's view first, and that is for interest rates to remain on hold through this year. They think one and done for an extended period of time. The reason that they believe that is on the basis of some forward-looking indicators that suggest that inflation should begin to slow down as we move through this year anyway. So that's looking at things like job advertisements. They have really rolled over, not significantly, but they're absolutely on a downwards trajectory. And that does suggest that we'll see things like the labour market soften as we move through 2026, a bit of an increase in unemployment and so on. If you look at things like surveys of businesses' expectations around their pricing pressures, they're not really suggesting that there's a huge pent-up increase in inflation that's set to be unleashed either. And we believe sort of that the economy is in a relatively stable sort of period. It's not absolutely shooting the lights out. There's some real differences across the states and territories that I'm sure that we'll talk to in due course. And that does mean that we don't need a significant hiking cycle to bring that inflationary story back down in line. On, I suppose, the other end of the spectrum, if we look at market pricing, market's expecting about 40 basis points of further rate hikes as we move through this year. So 1.5 hikes-ish, if we're thinking 25 basis points each time. So if you add that to the 25-point hike that we had a couple of weeks ago, really that just kind of returns us towards where interest rates were this time last year. So it's been a really short cycle in both directions, both in terms of those cuts last year and then where the market is expecting interest rates to go this year as well.
Well,
But I would say, sorry, just one more piece. The difference between researchers' view of on hold this year versus market expectations of those 40 basis points, that's a pretty narrow band, actually. That's really different to the experience during 22 and 23 when interest rates were going up by, I think, ultimately 425 basis points. So there was a much wider range of views there, and they had, of course, a much more material impact on businesses and households than what these, 25 to 65 basis points are likely to achieve.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you, off the back of some client conversations I've been having, what is your view on where the fixed rates are going?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing there is that they tend to move in advance of where the RBA cash rate moves. And we absolutely saw that towards the end of last year. Those longer term rates had already started to increase. So that means that businesses, both short term, looking at the BBSY, but some of the longer dated rates as well, really had started to increase. And that's already coming through in terms of the impact that it has on businesses and their funding costs. A really interesting point at this stage in the cycle is that for once Australia is leading the way globally. And what I mean by that is over the last couple of years, we were fairly slow to increase rates back in 22, 23, and the Reserve Bank really copped a lot of criticism for that. They were too slow to move. They didn't move aggressively enough, and that's why we had that really sharp increase in inflation. And then again, we were slower to cut rates than some of those other countries as well, because ultimately our economy was doing better by that point in time and we were able to. So it's not just a story about the RBA is slow. It's more just that our economy has dictated that we move slightly behind some of those other large developed economies that we compare ourselves to. But at this point in time, we are the first to increase interest rates, with the exception of Japan, but they're on a really different trajectory themselves. If we think about our experience compared to the likes of New Zealand, like I always bang on about, but the US and Canada and Europe as well, we are now at the forefront of the rate hiking cycle, and that's quite different to, let's just say, the US, where we're expecting another, I think, 2 rate cuts as we move through this year. So those diverging stories are going to have implications for your longer term rates as well, because there's not an absolutely consensus view around where interest rates are going to end up. And like I said before, the adjustment that we're expecting to see here is only relatively mild compared to what we had a couple of years ago. So for those longer term rates, they have picked up a little bit from here, but I don't think that's going to continue indefinitely given the different stories globally, but also the fact that we're not going to see short term rates increasing as much as what they did a few years ago.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to keep in mind that when we talk about interest rates, they really do have a material impact on businesses and households as well. And I think I mentioned BBSY, which a lot of your commercial borrowing is based on. And that really did increase towards the end of last year, of course, well in advance of the RBA actually moving. And for businesses on floating rates, that does start to impact their borrowing costs straight away, which of course is the whole point of the system, to try and slow things down a little bit. And equally, we can see that for households as well. Their borrowing costs, of course, don't increase until the RBA and then the banks pass that on. But it does impact sentiment. And we could see that in places like Sydney and Melbourne in the housing markets. We know that they're really auction-heavy markets, and auction clearance rates really did drop off towards the end of last year, I think because there was a lot of media commentary around that changing expectation of interest rates. People became just a little bit more cautious, thinking, what's this going to mean? Is it just one increase? Is it going to be a repeat of a couple of years ago, and it's a whole lot more than that. And so some of those household purchasing decisions were kind of put on pause a little bit. So we saw that pretty clearly at the end of last year, which is a good example, I think, of the way that these interest rates, and even just talking about them sometimes before they actually move, can have the very effect that the Reserve Bank is trying to engineer, I suppose.
How are we tracking as a country, as a whole?
Pretty well overall, I would say. Given a lot of volatility globally, I still think Australia is if not the place to be, one of the places to be globally. Our economy looks pretty resilient. The fact that we still have unemployment at such a low level, I think that's really important. I know we have the cost of living issues, like I mentioned earlier on, but from the average household point of view, we're the people that are able to obtain and retain employment. That's by far the most important feature of their household, instead of things like interest rates, for example. And the fact that we've been able to keep unemployment so low, employment as a country does keep on rising in a pretty nice trajectory. I think that's been a really positive outcome from the last couple of years. Having said that, though, and maybe this is a good place to start thinking about some of the state differences, the gap has really opened up over the last couple of quarters. I'm sitting here in Victoria, and the unemployment rate now is up to 4.5%. Tasmania is at 4.6%. So it's really that southeast corner that does have higher unemployment compared to the rest of the country. Every other state and territory in Australia has unemployment below 4%. Only just, 3.8, 3.9, sure, for example. But that's still a fairly noticeable gap that has opened. And I think when I was talking to you last year, I would have used language like Western Australia doesn't really need these rate cuts that we're going to get through 2025, but you're going to get them anyway because places like Victoria does need them. And now we're kind of at the other end of that cycle where a lot of the country is doing really well. Western Australia is still leading the way. Queensland is very strong. New South Wales has picked up momentum as well. They all look pretty good and probably need those rate cuts. But then if you look at somewhere like Victoria and Tasmania, really need those rate hikes. Victoria and Tasmania could have done without the rate hikes, to be honest, because we know mechanically that is going to, over time, work to soften the labour market, and we will see some further increase in the unemployment rate. So that's what I mean by the state differences are becoming really important. But if you phrase the question around how Australia as a whole is tracking, fairly well. We've seen a lot of that employment growth coming from a range of industries. A lot of it is still being driven by the public sector. So that's government spending on things like healthcare, aged care, education, public health and safety, and that sort of thing. And there's also a huge impetus to growth coming from government investment as well. And I'm really thinking there about all of the infrastructure that's taking place. And I know we spoke about that quite extensively last time, just the volume of road and rail work
we did
across the entire country. And if you go up to Brisbane, not even Brisbane, like southeast Queensland as a whole, absolutely frothing at the thought of the Olympics. And a lot of that work hasn't even kicked off yet. The plans are largely in place now, which is great, but that's still a really long runway to actually complete or start, construct and then complete a lot of those projects. So it means that the support to growth coming from the government sector is going to remain really positive, I think, for an extended period of time from a national point of view.
The last time we spoke, you said it was one of the, if I remember correctly, few times where you had both public investment in infrastructure and projects and private investment in infrastructure and projects. And that was driving, it was great because there's a lot of spending, there's a lot of infrastructure going in, but it put pressure on the labour market.
Yeah.
And it increased costs because there weren't enough people to do the work. Is that still the case?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And maybe if we think about it from a Western Australian lens, that's absolutely true. There's still a lot of investment taking place in the mining sector, for example. And it's not the same as the great big mining boom from 10, 12, 13 years ago now. But there is still a lot of investment taking place there. I'm thinking of all of those new critical minerals and that sort of thing that are driving new investment in new areas of regional Western Australia. And those resources, especially in terms of labour, like you mentioned, aren't available for free. They have to come from somewhere.
Yep.
And if they're moving to regional WA to construct a mine or increasingly to work on maintenance that's coming due across some of the larger LNG or iron ore projects as well, that is leaving a bit of a hole in the labour that's available to construct other parts of the economy, whether that's your housing or industrial buildings. The other thing that's really interesting, aside from the mining sector, and this is really a national story, is data centers, which it sounds like a bit of a cliche now because everyone just wants to talk about AI and data centers, but we can see the investment there coming through so very clearly, billions of dollars being spent in terms of upfront capital expenditure to get these projects off the ground. And once again, that's driving a lot of demand for labour in the construction phase that could be used elsewhere if that wasn't the case. So absolutely, it's true that there is investment coming through from the private sector as well. I wouldn't say the private sector is flying, though. On balance across the two, the public sector is absolutely outweighing it, but there are some of those emerging factors coming through, like different parts of the mining sector, data centres and that sort of thing. And then, of course, the energy, greenification of the power sources and that sort of thing is driving a lot of investment as well, and really adding onto the pile of demand for resources.
While we're talking about states, what is it about Victoria and Tasmania that's shifted where the unemployment is rising?
Yeah. Probably different drivers across the two states. I'll do Tasmania first because that's a really simple one, and that's just demographics. Their demographics are working so heavily against them, it's really hard to see a way out of this at this point in time. And I was visiting down there on my rounds a couple of months ago, and I forget the exact numbers now, but the gist of it was Tasmania's running about 20 years ahead of the rest of the country in terms of that ageing population. So the share of Australia's population that's over 65, we know that's increasing. That goes back to the health and aged care expenditure that I mentioned before. Tasmania was at that share about 20 years ago and still continuing to increase. We know that a lot of people, younger people, leave Tasmania for the opportunities further afield, especially historically in places like Melbourne, and then move back home for retirement, which is all well and good from a lifestyle point of view, but there's a real cost associated with that in terms of the health and aged care of those individuals and families. So it means that they do tend to lose younger people to the mainland, and then the people that they get back in are not in that working age population. So it makes it really difficult to have the correct balance of skills and experience and availability to really support economic growth. And that's a really big handbrake on their overall economy. For Victoria, a bit of a different story. The demographics are a lot more positive than that. We do have a really fast growing economy here in terms of, I should say a fast growing population story. Overseas migration, of course, is really, really positive. And while Victoria did lose people during COVID and in the subsequent couple of years, that has turned around now. We're not attracting people from the rest of the country like we used to pre-COVID, but it's basically net zero. So it means that our population growth overall is really strong because of the growth that's coming from overseas migration. So that kind of gives you a floor underneath where your economic growth is able to perform, just driven by the population story. So then what's kind of gone wrong there? A lot of it can be traced really back to the COVID experience, the lockdowns, the severity and the length of them. And I really don't enjoy banging on about that so many years later. But the fact is confidence in Victoria has been below the rest of the country for a really long time now, both households and businesses. So it does take a bit of time for that to really recover. We also see things like in the property space where I focus, of course, taxes have not done the property sector much of a favour. I think we spoke about that last time as
We
well.
did. Yep.
And land tax is the really good example there, where we are continuing to hear anecdotes of investors selling, their investment properties in Melbourne or regional Victoria, and looking to invest further afield, places like New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia as well. So, sort of all of those factors, especially around the confidence piece, are weighing on the Victorian economy. But I would just flag that those property taxes and land tax and investors selling up, they're not completely negative ideas. And the reason I say that is because we know Melbourne's housing prices have been so much weaker than the rest of the country. Not going backwards, but just the growth has been much more subdued. And in fact, Melbourne housing prices have grown slower than income growth. So what that means is that housing affordability has actually got better in Melbourne, which is a huge contrast to what's happened in most of the rest of the country. So in many ways, we can say, well, if say housing investors do want to sell up in Melbourne and invest somewhere else, okay, because that's creating the affordability for younger people in Melbourne. And that's why I am actually quite optimistic around the housing market in Melbourne, but also the economic growth factor as well. I think continuing to be able to attract those younger demographics that are more mobile, I think is a really important feature of your society, and that will support Melbourne's return back to a stronger growth story over the years ahead.
How's New South Wales looking? What's going on there? Because their economy is very different to ours over in the West.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, most places are different to yours out the West, aren't they? New South Wales, like I said, has picked up momentum. Things are looking better there now. There's more activity taking place. I think business confidence has really improved. To a degree, I wonder if they're just running the same story as Melbourne, but maybe a year or 18 months ahead, where the improvement in confidence is a really important ingredient, because it gives certainty in terms of businesses making those investment decisions, households making the longer term spending decisions as well. So that's really important, I think. Their population growth is not as strong as some other parts of the country, but it is positive again, which has changed a lot since the COVID times, of course. So overall, I think the New South Wales economy is in a pretty good place. It's really diverse, lots of different industries that are sort of driving that employment growth and that mix between private and the public sector as well. So I think that's a better story than where it has been for a couple of years.
And what about Queensland?
Queensland, absolutely. Just looking forward to the Olympics. And again, that's probably another cliche that comes out every time you hear about Brisbane. It's just Olympics, but it's very true. On the ground, everyone is looking forward to that. It's still a number of years away, but they really have had a charmed run over the last couple of years. Really different COVID experience, probably more similar to what happened in Western Australia, where domestic growth within the state was really positive, and then coming out the other side, Queensland and Western Australia continue to attract people from other parts of the country. Their population growth is very strong, especially in that southeast Queensland bucket, Brisbane, Sunny Coast, Gold Coast. So the population story is important. There's lots of infrastructure investment, and that's even before we really start the Olympic stuff, like I mentioned earlier. So that's a pretty strong pipeline to be looking forward to over the next 6 or so years. So there's still plenty of work to take place up there, and that does support, again, the confidence story on the ground today. One sort of concern around Brisbane that I do have, though, is that housing affordability has really worsened quite materially. Even though prices in Perth have increased more, affordability looks worse in Brisbane, and it's starting to get really stretched at the moment. And if we're thinking about housing prices have increased in the double digits in Brisbane and Gold and Sunny Coast again as well. Just in the last year, I do think there's going to be a turning point, even regardless of what interest rates do, where affordability just starts to look a bit too tough. And one, that means that your housing market might settle, if not come back a little bit, which wouldn't be the end of the world, but that does knock on your confidence, we know, in terms of the wealth effect. But then also, I think it starts to impact on, like I mentioned earlier, in terms of Melbourne and Victoria, the mobility of younger people. It used to be hugely attractive to move up to Brisbane and the Gold Coast because you're getting such a benefit in terms of more affordable housing. But if you strip that out, the Olympics are great, but you need other factors like affordable housing and plentiful jobs as well. So that's probably one of the concerns that I do have around that southeast Queensland market looking forward. But where things are today, though, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. South Australia is an interesting state. It's always had its ups and downs, and I hear a lot of murmurings around what it's doing and where it might not be going.
Yep.
What are you seeing from the data?
Yeah, absolutely. And ups and downs, yes, but pretty much only ups. Can't see what my hands are doing, but only ups for the last 5 or 6 years now. Their housing price growth has been unreal, similar to Perth and Brisbane. But it's really interesting because South Australia, you don't really see the broad drivers of growth. Like in Western Australia, it's really easy to say, well, you're gaining so many people from the rest of the country, your mining sector looks good, your public sector finances are in incredible shape. South Australia doesn't really have that. They've got a lot of defence spending, and a lot of that sub work is, highly skilled and paid engineers, so that's positive. But they still lose people to other parts of the country every year. The government finances aren't in as good a shape as what we see in Western Australia. And from that housing affordability point of view, so looking at house prices against income, Adelaide is the second least affordable market in the country, only behind Sydney, and not behind Sydney by very much, by the way. And that just reflects that over the last 6 years in particular, housing prices in Adelaide have absolutely skyrocketed and incomes haven't come close to keeping up. So while I mentioned a bit of concern around that affordability piece in Brisbane, Adelaide is actually of even more concern to myself. And they're still growing quite quickly on a monthly basis at the moment. But I truly don't think that can be sustained beyond, say, at some point this year, because the affordability story will just get too bad.
Yeah.
So some real challenges to come there, I think. Again, noting that unemployment is relatively low. There are jobs on offer at the moment, but I think that affordability will become very, very stretched.
We don't often talk about the Northern Territory. Is there anything happening up in that neck of the woods that's worth talking about?
Yeah, that's funny you ask, actually, because I've just started making plans to head up there myself in the middle of the year. And what got me chuckling was I went there in, I think, February last year, and I was talking about the affordability piece, as I do. And at the time I said, Darwin looks really affordable because it's actually cheaper to buy in Darwin than it is to rent, which is a really unusual situation, right? And since then, their prices have increased 20-odd%. So that story has flipped around a little bit. They've been one of the, probably alongside Perth, the fastest growing capital city over the last year. But we can see in the data that a lot of that is investors, and I think a lot of it will be interstate investors as well. So what that says to me is that investors might be moving out of some of those markets that they think have kind of run their course, whether that's places like Adelaide, Brisbane, even Perth as well, and kind of looking for other markets that haven't had the same sort of run. And like I said, 12 months ago, Darwin did look like a really good buying opportunity. In terms of affordability, it still does look pretty good. It's much more affordable there than other parts of the country, and there's obviously reasons for that in terms of not as diverse range of opportunities, for example. But the housing market has been a really interesting one to watch over the last year if we're thinking about what that means for the broader dynamic of investors. And we always talk about how In Australia, businesses and households are increasingly comfortable operating outside of their home state. And I think that's a really good example where you can quite clearly see investors maybe leaving one state behind and looking
Yep.
elsewhere for where those opportunities present. And that's kind of been the story for Darwin over the last 12 months.
Is there anything that you'd want to comment on around Canberra before we move to the big state?
Canberra looks pretty solid. Really low unemployment rate. They typically do because a lot of it is the public sector. And like I mentioned before, the public sector has been really one of the key drivers of the economy. What Canberra's done really well from a housing point of view is keep up with supply versus demand. Their demand story isn't as strong as other parts of the country. No one's absolutely, screaming out to move to Canberra. No offence, but the numbers there are a bit slower than places like Perth and
Yep.
Brisbane, for example. But they have actually kept up with supply, and what that means is that their housing prices, they've been stronger than Melbourne. Melbourne's like right down the bottom in terms of what's happened the last few years. But the growth in Canberra has been much more moderate, and I think a lot of that comes back to the supply that's been made available, because you can see that on the rental affordability side as well. So that is one positive story. But I think in general, Canberra's kind of steady as she goes. A lot of the public sector supporting that general economy.
So my home state, what's going on over here?
WA. Shooting the lights out once again. I think that would have been the theme last time we caught up a year ago. And to be honest, that's been the story for the last 5 years or so, hasn't it? Everything has looked pretty good. I'm trying to recall last year, had gold started to kick off by the time we spoke?
No,
Maybe not.
I think, gold started to
sorry.
kick off a bit later.
Yeah, and so maybe that was a story I was talking through across other parts of the country about how blessed Western Australia is, because you've had, the growth in iron ore and LNG and then all the critical minerals, and then out of nowhere last year, your gold prices start going absolutely through the roof as well. So just another nice little bucket of revenue for your producers, exporters, and for your government as well. And I mentioned before, government finances in Western Australia look very, very attractive, running strong surpluses over the next couple of years, and they really do look nicely baked in. There's always some degree of optimism, I think, in government budgets and the outlook for the future, but there's a lot of reasons to be really optimistic around what that's going to look like for WA. Nice low unemployment rate. I mentioned on the housing affordability side that your prices have increased significantly. They've more than doubled in the last 6 years, which is honestly crazy growth. And from a societal point of view, probably not ideal. But that also reflects that your prices were so subdued going into COVID. And even where you sit today, on average, if you take out a new mortgage in Western Australia, you're looking at about 42% of the average income to service the mortgage. That compares to like 48% in Brisbane, about 50% in Adelaide, and maybe like 52 in Sydney. So those other places you can kind of see it kind of tapped out around that 50% of income, but Perth is still not at that level, which to me suggests that if everything else stays nice and steady through this year, Perth housing prices probably have a bit further to run than places like Adelaide and Brisbane do. But outside of housing, the government finances look good. The mining sector is really positive. There's that investment in those critical minerals, some new exploration and investment in new construction of new mines as well. So that's good. Overall, commodity prices are fairly attractive. It's not like absolute boom time, but it is supporting the general economy and the state as well. Probably one challenge though, and I think this goes back to your question before around that competition for resources that we're seeing in terms of labour, like on the construction side. inflation in Western Australia is running harder than what's happening in the rest of the country. And as a result, we have seen household spending in WA come back a little bit. Still increasing, but at a slower pace than what it had been doing previously. And I think that does reflect that households are starting to feel some of this impact of, for recent purchases, rising housing prices, but also greater inflationary pressure as well, and sort of squeezing budgets a little bit. Nothing to be alarmed about at this stage, but that's absolutely a theme that has been playing out and probably does mean that your growth isn't going to be as sharp through 2026 as what it has been, through 25 or 24.
Yeah.
But in general, there's a really nice story in Western Australia that's split between the private and the public sector. Finance is looking good in general. So a really good starting point and reasons to be optimistic about that growth continuing through this year as well.
Do you see any data around commercial property in WA?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's different themes there. The commercial market is just so diverse across the states and across the asset types as well. So if you look at offices in Perth, for example, the headline number that would get attention is the vacancy rate for Perth offices is about 17%, which on the one hand is way too high. That's still not a balanced market. But the difference is that number is a lot lower than it was before COVID, because you did have a weak economy and a weak office sector through the late 2010s. So from a peak of about 25%, your vacancy rate has come all the way down to 17, which is actually a really nice trajectory. And if we think about the outlook for supply of new offices, that looks really, really constrained in Perth. So what that means is that every year you are still absorbing new space, which is good. And last year was the strongest take-up of office space in about 5 or 6 years. So it's gaining momentum. So you're absorbing space. There's not new supply on the horizon over the next year or two. And so that means that headline vacancy rate is absolutely going to continue to come back down through 26 and into 27 as well. So that's a really good news story that I think probably goes underappreciated, because if you just look at that vacancy number, you just think, oh, dearie me, that's no good.
That is high.
And it's not great. But all of the dynamics around that number actually are telling a positive story. So that's one thing to look for in the office sector through this year. On the industrial side, this is a story that's absolutely consistent across the whole country. And that reflects the fact that while demand for industrial property is still really strong, I'm thinking about drivers there like online retailing, the mining sector increasingly ramping up their storage and warehousing requirements from a WA lens, and then also the fact that businesses on average are holding greater inventory levels today compared to what they did before COVID. Some of that reflects the uncertainty around supply chains and maybe a bit of scarring left over from that. But it's also, I think, a symptom of consumers demanding everything, same day, next day delivery. So your inventory does have to be higher by default. So there's a couple of drivers that we know have been playing out for a few years, but are still increasing. That's driving demand for the industrial space. So the demand is great. But it's the supply side that's really changing the balance of that market now. And I've been talking for probably 18 months about the wave of new building approvals that have been coming through in the industrial space. And we can absolutely see that now converting into the construction and the completion of new industrial buildings. And what that means from a WA lens, but really consistent across the country, is that while your headline rents are maybe still nudging a little bit higher, the growth of 10, 15, 20% year on year is gone. But the headline rents are still increasing just a little bit. But then we're seeing more incentives coming into play as well. So in the Perth market, that's still relatively minor. It might be like 5 or 10% incentives in terms of fit out or rent-free periods upon signing new leases. But when you strip out the effect of those incentives and you just look at underlying net rents, they've really stalled and might even have gone backwards a little bit compared to, say, 2 years ago. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic there, because we still, from a banking hat on point of view, still absolutely love the industrial asset class because the demand side is so strong and we believe in those fundamentals. But the supply piece has absolutely changed that story. And if we look at building approvals are still elevated, there's still a big backlog of industrial work that will get completed over the next maybe 12 or 18 months. And all of those new additions to supply are going to keep putting some pressure on the rental market. And so that should mean that we see a much more balanced market going forward, where tenants are more readily able to move around, change their location or size of buildings as they need to. Whereas beforehand, through really 2020 to about 24, when rents were increasing so rapidly, it was really hard for businesses to upsize their requirements if needed. They were paying a huge premium to be able to do so, and that did mean that a lot of businesses weren't actually able to expand as they would have desired to meet the demand that was out there. So I think this is a really positive development from a broader economy point of view. It's going to give businesses that are renting those properties a lot more flexibility and freedom. But like I said, we still absolutely love the demand story for industrial property, but it's just that balance is really important instead of it being a really one-sided sort of affair.
Do you see much data on agriculture, fruit and veggie growing, that sort of stuff?
I don't, but I have wonderful equivalents in my team at ANZ that cover the agri space. Maybe I should flick you their details, because they'd absolutely love to jump on something like this as well.
Yeah, I'd love to, because we don't often talk about those sorts of drivers in our country and our economy. But food security is a question, land availability. We've got growers who are major parts of the supply chain. They're almost being pushed out for a number of reasons out of the areas they're growing in for urbanisation. Part of it will be water supply. There are so many things that go on.
Yes.
And I feel like they're incredibly important issues to talk about if we want food security in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a story there'd be Western Australian nuances to it, undoubtedly, but that's really important across the entire country. Every state and territory has some element of agriculture taking place, with different drivers and product, of course. But the broader story there, like you say, around urbanisation, water requirements are incredibly important. And probably something that, again, our future planning, I know we spoke a lot about our lack of forward planning last time, probably doesn't do us too many favours on that front either.
Yeah, I would love to think at some point in the very, very near future, our governments, and maybe there's a way where there's some pressure that can be put on, start to, I don't know if I should say start to plan properly, because maybe they are doing work, we just don't see it. But I don't know. And I think it's the I don't know, which is part of the issue.
Yeah. Well, the I don't know is really important. And, I mentioned everyone wants to squeeze data centres into conversations now, so I'm going to do it. Their water and electricity requirements are absolutely incredible, and they're absolutely sprouting up across the country. And I don't think there's a concise plan or a clear plan around how that availability of power and water is going to play out over the longer term, because it's still really early days for us here, but you can kind of see it just heading in one direction. And all of that power and water doesn't, similar to the Labor story, it doesn't come for free. It gets diverted from somewhere else.
Absolutely.
And I think governments, at all levels really, are kind of scrambling to keep on top of this, especially on the power side, where we are going through a really significant period of change anyway in terms of electrification and electric vehicles and all of that sort of stuff. The demands on the grid are so different to what we could have expected, as recently as, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And then we throw data centers on top as well. There's a lot of change taking place there. So absolutely agree. The long-term planning, I think, could be improved, but there genuinely are some, generational shocks that come through that do upset that kind of planning that you're very difficult to allow for.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like the conversation around core infrastructure to support the industries that we need isn't happening. There are generational changes, and there are large changes in technology that are happening now, and some of them you can't see coming. That's fine. You can't plan for what you don't know. But there are a lot of other key aspects of what I feel we should be doing, and I don't know whether there's this conversation about it. That's my big I don't know.
Yeah, as an economist, I have plenty of I don't knows, but the key is to acknowledge them and not just bury them.
Yeah.
Because I always come back to the way that a lot of the infrastructure that we're building today, we say that it should have been done 20, 30, 40 years ago. But the thing is, 40 years ago, we would never in our wildest dreams have anticipated that Australia would be as big as what it is today. So that's, a really fundamental gap. All of this stuff is revolving around serving the population that live in Australia. And if we can't get the population numbers right, in terms of the numbers, but the location of them as well, it kind of makes everything else like a domino flow-on effect. If you can't get the first one right, the rest of them aren't going to fall either.
Yep. And somebody and there is a bit of guesswork in there, educated guesswork, but there is guesswork in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we talk about population growth? Have you seen the data on where you think the population might be in 5 years and what that demographic spread looks like?
Yeah, I don't have a catchy number for 5 years, but what we can say is that obviously population growth was really slow during COVID because no overseas migration coming in. As soon as borders opened again in 22, we had all-time record levels of growth, both in percentage terms and in the number of people as well. That has come down a little bit, but it's still sitting a long way above pre-COVID averages. So from a Western Australian point of view, your population increased about 2.2% last year, which is 2% doesn't sound like a big number, but for a variable that typically doesn't move much at all, that actually is a huge impact. That's much faster than the rest of the country. Places like Queensland and Victoria were next at 1.8%. So there's a real big gap there where Western Australia is growing a lot faster, and a lot of that is because of overseas migration, but also the combination of interstate migration, like we touched on before. You're actively attracting people from other parts of the country into Western Australia. So in terms of the demographic impact of that, we know that Australia's population is ageing. I touched on that before. We do have a rapidly ageing 65 plus profile, and we're seeing that now starting to play out as the baby boomers enter retirement across those number of years. But we also know that people are living longer as well. So it's not just saying plus 65, because we're going to get more and more 75 plus, 85 plus, 95 plus. And all of that does sort of come at a cost in terms of the health and aged care requirements, again, like we touched on earlier. So what's happening is that a really important way of being able to service that ageing population is by increasing your younger demographic profile as well. And we know that birth rates in Australia, for probably a myriad of reasons, have slowed right down. And if your birth rates are slowing down, the only way that you can increase your working age population is through overseas migration. And that's essentially why we have had this really sharp inflow over the last couple of years. Initially, some pent up demand post COVID, but even since then, the numbers have been really strong, and I think are going to continue to be for some period of time. Always like to think about supply and demand. The demand for people coming here is, I know political issues aside, the demand for those people is underpinned by the ageing population. We have to have workers to service that demographic, and that means they need to come from overseas. And then the supply of people looking to move here, like I said right at the start, where else would you rather be? I think Australia would be right at the top of the list for most people around the world that are looking to move. So I think that means that we're going to continue to see strong population growth, maybe not at the same rate that we've had over the last couple of years, but it is going to be pretty rapid. And ultimately, that means that we do need to be thinking, like you say, about the long-term infrastructure challenges associated with that. For example, I was looking at some numbers for Western Australia just before I mentioned your 2.2% growth rate. That's about 65,000 people that you added into Western Australia last year. Vast majority of those would be in Perth. So that means that we probably should have built around 30,000 homes to kind of absorb that if we just want to net things out nicely, just over 2 and a bit people per dwelling. So we should have built about 30,000. We built about 22. So a really big gap there. But even that 22,000 is the strongest number in a fair few years. 2 years before that, I think a record low for Western Australia, it was like 12,500 homes got built at the same time as your population growth was even stronger than it is today. So a lot of that dynamic explains the housing price growth that you have had, especially in Perth, and that the pressure there will continue unless we continue to do a better job of building more homes to absorb that population that I think is almost certainly going to continue to arrive.
Yeah, and you can see that in housing availability. I think it was 2 weeks ago, there were 1,500 properties on the market, which is nothing.
Yep. Yeah, it's pretty tight.
Yeah.
Very tight. Yes.
Yep.
And I'm not sure what your papers in Western Australia are like, but even in Melbourne, every other week we'll see photos of rental inspections, and there's a queue of young people, 100 people deep, to look at some crappy, two-bedder apartment that probably needs a bit of work done to it, but there's just not the options out there. And I'd imagine that's at least the same, if not worse, in Perth.
Yeah. I think... I don't know about the rest of the country, but it's the common story here. What do you think about HMOs, so housing with multiple occupancy? So people are building 6x6s now.
Mm-hmm.
So you can move into, if you're a single person, instead of lining up at a home open to rent a property with 50 other people, you can actually rent a room with its own bathroom, and there are shared amenities. Are you seeing much of that on the eastern states? It's only starting to kick off here.
I wouldn't say much of it. There's some, absolutely. There's probably a lot of different options compared to the past. Maybe by the time you add together products like that, co-living sort of stuff, even dedicated build to rent is a bit different to the build to sell model that we've seen previously. So I don't think any of those are like a single silver bullet to solve housing affordability and supply, but I think they absolutely help. And just being able to have the options depending on your individual circumstances is a really powerful tool. So I don't see too many of those, but absolutely aware of them. And I think part of the overall supply story, bring it on. As long as it's in the right places, I would say, actually. The zoning is really important, and I would think things like that absolutely need to be, near well-located public transport. There's no point building that out in some greenfield area that doesn't get a train station for another 8 years or something.
Yep.
And there's probably some bad examples of that occurring, especially in like the greater Melbourne sort of region.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think human beings are creative and we find new solutions to new problems. And I'm certain we will.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a whole host of exciting developments in that area, I reckon. I'm thinking about robotic bricklayers and concreters and that sort of thing. Anything that can support, the productivity of the construction sector is really positive because that has gone backwards over a number of years, which is kind of part of the story. A lot of that's for good reason, like health and safety issues. But if we can improve health and safety records, but also generate some efficiencies where we can, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I love it. Before I ask you to give us a roundup and what you think's really good, what are we not doing well?
As a country, what are we not doing well? Well, I think a lot of it just does come back to that longer term planning, like we've probably already spoken to. I think some of that in turn traces back to a lack of communication between the different levels of government. I think that is really one of the challenging features in Australia, having a combination of local, state, and federal government. And because I'm always thinking with my housing and property hat on, I really do think the supply story would be greatly simplified if we just had one level of approvals or regulatory bodies across the entire country that dealt with zoning and that sort of thing. I think the different levels make that really challenging. And while pretty much everyone in the country talks about housing affordability and how it's a real issue, they know that the best answer to that is to build more homes. But until that communication and cooperation, I think, is greatly improved, it's really hard to take those sentiments seriously. So that's probably my number one thing is everybody being much more greatly aligned. But having said that, very, very difficult given the way that those layers of government are already embedded. We can't just chop one out.
No, it's actually far more difficult than it sounds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. If it was easy, they would have done it already.
Correct. But then we'd have nothing to talk about. How many times do I say housing affordability? I don't want to say affordability again for another week. Maybe there'd be other things to talk about. But.
Well, that's your. I'm giving you the challenge now. We've all heard you say it. So for the rest of the week, you're not allowed to use those words.
I'm going to struggle at my next presentation, that's for sure.
Yeah, there'll be another word you can use instead of affordability, but you're not allowed to use that word.
Yeah. How about the rest of this podcast? Try and wrap up without using it.
All right. Give us a wrap up. How are you feeling about the whole state of the place? What's really good? Because there are a lot of good things to talk about.
Oh, there's so many good things, and I really hope that has come across. I know we have talked to the challenges as well, because it's really easy to get sucked into those, but I think that's always coming from a good place of wanting to be ambitious and wanting to be better and the best. But I always, like I opened with, we are really blessed in Australia. What a fantastic place to live, and especially in Western Australia, we're just so naturally endowed with all of those minerals and ores and gas and so on, which is absolutely fantastic. And I think just the diverse range of growth opportunities that we have as a country, but again, especially in WA, should leave us feeling really optimistic about the future. And I know it's easy to get caught up in negativity around, oh dear, the Reserve Bank's increasing interest rates 0.25%, and don't want to make light of that, because I know that for some individuals that might start to push them into a difficult financial position. But from an overall point of view, I think if that's the worst thing that's going on, it means that we're in a really, really good place, to be honest. So absolutely some challenges ahead around housing supply and what that means for prices as well. But again, always coming back to households and their position, lots of opportunities for jobs. The starting point for the labour market is really good. And I think that'll continue for some time, especially in Perth.
Thanks, Dan. It was great to have you back on the podcast giving us your views to 2026.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me. It's the highlight of my calendar now.
We'll check in 2027, if not sooner.
Looking forward to it. And hopefully a couple of the things that I've said have been accurate. We'll find out.
Well, yeah, we'll find out in a year's time. You may be one of a very few.
Thanks, mate. Always a pleasure.
Good on you. See ya.